The Spirit of God is moving upon His people, and He is raising up a generation that is prepared for power that will touch this world.
They lived amongst the ruins, they were the last human force. The remnant that refused to serve the robot Trojan horse. Forced to migrate underground, avoiding drones and scans. To navigate the darkness and get birth without implants. The time we knew was coming, the breaking of the seals. Unfolding right before our eyes, the Antichrist revealed. Technology advanced beyond the scope of human hands. Attached itself inside the soul of man and took command. But those who saw it coming were the fragment that remained. Avoiding the enslavement and the merging of all brains. They were forced below the surface in the darkness of the caves. Inside the belly of the beast that carry on the flame. Like relics from the past, they were progenitors of truth. No human leader but the word of God to show them through. But they counted themselves worthy to suffer for His name. A blessing to be living and rejoicing through the pain. They were born to be survivors, predestined for that time. Protected and preserved to be a witness to the blind. Like those who came before this, the Daniels and the Jonas, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's were in the furnace. Like Noah in the flood, they were preserved inside the ark. A chosen few remained and were uniquely set apart. The world turned all against them, yet their mission still remained. They lived each day alive in Christ and knew to die was gain.
They have been in the wilderness, they have been in the caves, they have been in obscurity, they have been behind the scenes. No one has known their names, no one even recognized them, but they have been recognized by heaven because they have been seeking the face of the Father and calling on God behind the scenes. Heaven knows their name and hell knows their name.
Now it's all a distant memory before the singularity. Long before technology invaded our biology. Like history repeating, it was written to unfold. These mysteries all leading to the oldest story told. They built upon the tower until Babylon gave birth, attempting to be gods by making flesh and iron merge. Although we saw it coming, we didn't know it was so near. Some tried to look away to ignore their deepest fears, but with each passing moment it enveloped every mind. Through comfort and convenience and expanding human lives, expanding information too explosive to contain, beyond the scope and understanding of our tiny brains. It soon became the norm to transform the human form. The brewing of a coming storm we've never seen before. The day we started customizing children by design and modifying DNA to make ourselves divine. First the powerful elitists all begin to get implants. The rich and famous followed suit to be the most advanced. They thought themselves enlightened, so much wiser and evolved. Most didn't know the root of all that's evil was involved. Uploaded all their minds inside an AI quantum hive, made in the image of a man. The beast now come alive. They relinquished all control and put their trust in the machine, and extinguished any chance that souls could ever be redeemed.
And God is bringing them out to the forefront in this time to change the course of history and change a generation and bring a revolution of revival. So one day, this last generation will step right into heaven.
Happy Friday, everybody. It is Friday, February 12th, and you know, time must be moving faster and faster because I feel like we just had my good friends NPC and Gary Wayne, so let me welcome them again. I got NPC here as my co-host. Hi, NPC.
Many meow, Shabbat Shalom, folks.
And he is here to help me because he is on a higher level of intellect than myself. And Gary, we put at the top notch of intellect. So welcome, Gary Wayne. Glad to have you back.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and very excited to be back with such intelligent people, I must say.
Well, praise the Lord, because, you know, I feel like I learned so much from you, and that's a good thing. It's okay that I don't have it all figured out yet, but you certainly have the brain that holds a lot of information. We appreciate that you're willing to give it to us, Gary.
Well, thank you, but I want to sort of underscore that nobody knows everything.
That's true. That's true.
And there's a lot that I don't know, believe me, but I do have a passion for things that maybe some people aren't all that interested in or want to have an interest in, but not to maybe the obsessive level that I get into it at times.
And by the way, guys, I have the website for Gary at the very top of the screen. It says Genesis6conspiracy.com. You should go there because of all the information you can get. But better yet, you should buy the book, of the Genesis 6 conspiracy, because while it has been shortened from its original 1,200 pages, it is a great 800-page book, and you can get more documents from Gary. He will answer your emails if you email him and want to know more information from the man himself, and he will sign the book for you if you order it through the website. Isn't that right, Gary?
That's absolutely correct. And yes, the book has been shortened, but the next book that's coming out won't be, I'm hoping, not as big as that one, but it'll fill in a lot more information as well. But yes, you can get a signed copy through my website.
Which is how
And
I wish I would have done it. Go ahead, NPC.
I did that with my grandmother, actually. She liked the book a lot.
Did she read the whole thing?
I haven't got to visit her since she started it, but that's going to be what we talk about the next time I visit.
How fun. And I'll tell you, Gary, what I do is I like talking to you and going over some of the chapters, although tonight isn't, it's all connected, so I'm sure some of those subjects in the chapters will come up, but tonight isn't necessarily over specific chapters, but I have enjoyed going over certain chapters with you, and then I'm able to go back and read it, and it makes so much more sense to me, so I appreciate you educating me on 2 levels here.
Well, I appreciate that. And, you know, there's so much information in the book that there's no way somebody can sort of comprehend all of that information. And, you know, when I was writing the book and editing it and rereading it, and then I read it again last year just to make sure I wasn't sort of forgetting about stuff. And there's just so much that, you know, I wrote the book, but I forgot I wrote a lot of the stuff that's in there. And it's just, there's that much information. So if people are looking for a treasure trove of information on subjects that are all interconnected, it might be a book for you, but do not try and speed read it. You might pop some brain cells.
Speed reading is yeah, it might be that interesting, but at the same time, it's a heavy subject and I think reference to scripture is great, and also yourself as, not you, Gary, but people listening, a reference to scripture and maybe doing even a Bible study with the book is something that a way to take it nice and slow. And I have had people recommend that or offer that up as something that I know I would enjoy. Real quick, you guys, part of what I do on this channel is try to help people with sound money, tangible assets like gold and silver. And because I do that, one of the things I do to get gold and silver into your hands is I have raffles, and Gary was aware we were going to do this, so I'm not surprising him. But real quickly, I was going to draw a raffle from earlier for a 2-ounce silver round that's very kind of cute. It's got the mama alligator and the baby alligator. Maybe it's a crocodile. Forgive me if I got that wrong. I think it's an alligator, because doesn't the crocodile have the eyes on top of its head? Anyway, I will draw this really fast. All I have to do is quickly go over here. We've got 2 people only on this raffle. We've got Justin and Marie bought out all the spots for this 2-ounce coin or round, and it is a coin actually. And if you didn't know, silver is very hard to come by right now, and yet I still have silver to raffle. And in a while, maybe in a month or so, we'll probably do another trivia thing. Gary probably doesn't know, but Gary, we did a trivia deal where people won silver from our trivia night, kind of put together, NPC put it together like Jeopardy. So that was a pretty awesome thing. So real quick, I'll draw this and we'll move on with Gary Wayne. And I'll just say a couple things, Gary, that I wanted you to know before we start, and we'll kind of go into it. Okay, so here we go. Drawing the raffle out of 11 people, and everybody can see because I've got the display on, and it's number 6 that won, and that person is Justin, who thought he was on a losing streak. And he beat out Marie. Congratulations, Justin. Okay, so we got that out of the way, which is a nice, simple, and fun thing that we do here. But Gary, I wanted to tell you, I was talking to a friend tonight and my parents, and we were kind of talking about Valentine's Day, and we were saying, she was telling me, my friend, how she had gotten a rose for her son and a roses for her boyfriend's daughters. And I did the whole thing that makes everybody uncomfortable. And I was like, well, if you knew the history of this holiday, you wouldn't want to celebrate it at all. It's really gross. But anyway, let's kind of get into that. I don't know if you want to start somewhere specific or you want us to ask questions, but in general, I bet you probably understand a little bit of the history of the festival of Lupercalia. Do you want to give us a quick or long, not even quick, rundown of what the festival was about as far as your understanding?
Sure, I can do that. That's probably a good way to start, and then sort of maybe peel back from there. I want to also sort of preface as I talk about St. Valentine's Day and I want people to sort of understand that I'm not against people celebrating holidays and things like that, and I'm not here to demean people who do or Christians in particular. It's a matter of understanding how we're immersed in the world, where whether or not some of the celebrations and holidays that we celebrate as Christians have been usurped and overlaid with polytheism. And that's a standard MO by polytheists, so that they take away the meaning of the holiday and give it its whole recognition and iconology that is strictly polytheist for the most part. And so I think it's important for Christians to understand what is Christian tradition, if I can put it that way, versus polytheist tradition, and to know the difference and then make your own free choice from there. But it always helps to have the information. So when we look at Valentine's Day, let's look at it from a Christian perspective first, and then go move it back in terms of the Feast of Lupercalia, or there's a couple other names there which I'll touch on in a minute or two. Typically, February 14th is selected allegedly, and the Vatican would suggest that they actually have a couple of dates for a couple of individuals that they have in mind for St. Valentine's Day. One is a particular fellow who died in 269 on February 14th. He was martyred as a Christian. And so we need to understand that this is something that can come about sort of from a very innocent sort of perspective. And I'm fine with the celebration of the feast of St. Valentine and an honoring of somebody who's an honor, not to worship them, but to honor them. And that legend begins with the most sort of common sort of consensus as to which of the saints they're referring to, is that he writes a letter to the daughter of his jailer just before he is executed, and addresses it to her as your Valentine. Of course, his name is Valentine. And it's a goodbye. So apparently they would have had communications and a relationship, but it was sort of his farewell note to the jailer's daughter. And the other one is about Valentine, who performed weddings. And I'm not even sure this guy's name was Valentine, but he performed weddings for soldiers who were forbidden to marry, because at that time soldiers were forbidden to marry because they weren't expected to live all that long. So in 496, Pope Gelasius, in 496 AD, he establishes February 14th as this feast day, which is his execution date of the Valentine in 269 who wrote the note. And that's where giving notes and cards and things is sort of extended from in terms of St. Valentine's Day. But what is also interesting is that there's this, and it has a few different names to it. Lupercalia is the festival that runs from February 13th to 15th, so 3 days, or in and around St. Valentine's Day. And it's an ancient Roman celebration, and probably goes back to the Etruscans, which were the people that were in Italy and Rome before the Romans and the Latins took over and gained power. And also it's really interconnected between those kinds of religions as you take that back. But what happens is on February 15th, it became a popular day for courting. And this is kind of the introduction into the spring festivals of fertility, and then into the May festivals of maidens and things like that. And there was all of these extraordinarily polytheist, strange kind of rituals of sacrifices and running around half naked and running through the streets and tracking down women, and very much a something that we would find probably quite offensive today. And that was so right after the 14th, you have the 15th. But understand that this festival is 13, 14, and 15. And it was also known as Juno Fructifer and Juno Februata. And Februata is where you get the month of February from. And typically, the solar calendar is to honor the gods, right? The 12 months, whether it's, doesn't matter which month that you're going to look at, and or a Roman demigod is in August for Augustus, for example. And same with the days of the week. So understand that this is very much in the tradition of kind of polytheism, that they're going to overlay and usurp this feast day of St. Valentine with, and becomes all of the types of rituals that we are talking about today with some of the figures and things. And this was a festival of the queen of the Roman gods and goddesses. And so this is not a Christian overlay at all. This is an overlay that is steeped in ancient Roman polytheism, both the Etruscans and the Romans. So I'll leave it at that and let you guys in and just see where you want to go with it from there, or whether or not we want to talk a little bit more about sort of that Roman period before I start sort of talking about Cupid and things like that.
Oh, so. Yeah, we're going to get to that too. That's great because I almost forgot to mention, this is the first of its kind when it comes to a Valentine's special with Gary Wayne. So I feel very honored for that. Not because you're a superstar and a celebrity that's out of touch and out of reach, but it's just fun that it's a new subject that you have said you haven't done a live video of. So this is exciting. I know that NBC has more questions and great notes than me, so I'm going to start with my kind of topic questions and discussion. But I looked into it from the standpoint of like Romulus and Remus and the ritual sacrifice, and I've got a website pulled up that just kind of talks about the basics of it from history.com, a very mainstream source, but it gets into the feast of Lupercal, and from what I read, it seemed like a more bloody, violent, sexually, like this website says, sexually charged celebration amidst animal sacrifice, even the wearing of the skins, I think, of some of the animals. So I wondered if we wanted to give like a bit of a history of that Roman tradition of Lupercalia. And my question on that is that where it started, do you believe? Because I think this says it goes back to 6th century BC, so pretty far back of this feast, or does it have its origins even further back than that?
Yeah, as we're going to get into, it does have older traditions than that, and in fact, that would be, rooted in the parent gods that were well before the flood. So this is 600 BC. 753 is when Rome is set up or established by Romulus and Remus in legend on 7 hills, which also has a connection in here. And this is a tradition that is inherited. And understand that the Latins and the Etruscans are latter sort of expansion of the nations. And understand that the flood was circa 2350 BC. So you have, using biblical chronology, so you have a long period since the flood. And this is actually a tradition of antediluvian gods that go back into, the time of the Nephilim. So yes, it is very, very, very much older than that tradition that starts in about 600 BC or so. So we need to understand it in that kind of context, that this is just a legacy of that pantheon that's passed down through generations. And the rituals that they do, and I didn't spend a lot of time on the detail on it because some of it is actually pretty gruesome. So I thought maybe I would probably skip over that. So unless you really wanted to get into some of that, the details of that, then I think we can probably leave it. It was sexual. There were sacrifices. There were bizarre things that were being done. And it was not a civilized sexual orgy on steroids. It was more than that.
Is that
Why?
where we get the word debauchery, essentially?
No, I think debauchery even goes back before the floods. So
I would say, as far as like the exact rituals, I'm sure it wouldn't be. Is it? I'll ask you. Is it hard for if somebody was very interested in the description of those rituals, they could probably find it themselves?
yeah, they could find it. Basically, if you're going to just sort of Google for it, I mean, you're going to get some information on it. Now, understand though that what you're going to read about is sort of what the lower level people did, right? As opposed to the adept level of the rituals. So anything that is being sacrificed or anything that is sexual that the masses would be participating in, the adept level or the priest level would be significantly above that in its grotesqueness.
I have a question about twins are pretty important in kind of the elite, the ascension, the hermetic alchemy, and what seems like maybe with the fallen angels. And Romulus and Remus were twins. Can you tell us a little bit about Romulus and Remus themselves?
Not my super level of expertise, other than they were some sort of offspring demigods that were orphaned, and they were nursed to adulthood by a wolf and a wolf's family. And so that's probably an allegory for something. It probably has something to do with the what I would call the werewolf mythology, because understand that pretty much everything that is talked about in the Roman pantheon and legend and mythology is extended from the Greek religion and legend and mythos. So, and anytime you're talking about a wolf, that usually is an allegory for something that is another kind of being. So when you have King, I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, Lupercus, I think it is, who is, and King Lycon, depending on which format that you're looking at, he is changed into a werewolf, a changeling, as a demigod Nephilim king for not following Zeus. And so is this whole family. And then they start this whole sort of bloodline. So typically you're going to see that sort of extend over to the Roman pantheon. And that may be an extension of Lycon's family. And I'm kind of speculating on that because you don't really get anything before that in terms of Roman history, other than you have these unexplained demigod children who are seemingly left out somewhere as a sacrifice to the gods. So we're not told a whole bunch more about that in terms of what we can really sort of get our hands around, but they end up being raised and then they end up establishing Rome City on the 7 hills of Rome that they became famous for.
So I know that NPC has some questions for you, so I'm going to let him go with. Oh, and somebody asked you to spell Lycons, if you wouldn't mind, real quickly. Tell us how that's spelled.
Couple different ways, Lycon or Lycaen, as my memory recalls the two different transliterations of it. But if you just again just Google, even something close on that and Zeus together with it, you'll get that brought up in terms of the werewolf mythology.
Which would explain why they called them Lycans in the Underworld movie.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah,
Yep.
You were gonna say.
That's exactly where they're picking up on that name from, and that somehow the werewolves are related to the dog warriors, but different, and these are more changelings than what the dog warriors are. But you get dog men coming and the dog Nephilim coming from the Greek gods as well in Greek mythology, just as you get that coming from other gods around, let's say in Egypt, like the jackal god Anubis. And so you'll have a city that's called Lycopolis and a couple other names that are similar to that. They used to have a full city of these sort of dog people, but they're, again, I think the werewolf is a little bit distinct because of these are demigods already. These are Nephilim heroes already that are transformed by Zeus into werewolves.
All right, so I'm going to give it to NPC for a second and let him ask his questions because I know he wanted to talk about the cave, which is also what I have up on the screen. So go for it, Mr. NPC. Uh-oh, did I lose him?
Oh, I forgot I was muted. So, anyway, yeah. Oh, you wanted to go straight to the cave because.
Well, we don't have to do that. I just happen to have that up.
Yeah, you can keep it up for a
start
minute.
wherever you want.
Well, what I wanted to first point out was while I was just doing a quick search there to bring up a link for the Faunus, is that what his name was? Lupercus, King Faunus. He's the protector of cattle, and the word vaca is it actually means cattle, and so he's also Pan. So I just find it weird that we have pandemic and vaccine being so relevant right now. Kind of weird.
Well, and it's also connected. You have the Etruscan god named Cernunnos.
Oh yeah.
I'm sorry. That is the Welsh god. The Etruscan version is the shorter version, Cern. So you also have the Pan Temple over in Mount Hermon, which was thought to be similar to the caves, and that's why it was connected as to what is in the Greek region, and that is called, the gateway, or the rock of the gods, and the gateway of Hades. And so typically you have these satyr gods, and Bacchus would be another kind of satyr god that is also part of the Roman history. So you have all of these class of sort of degraded fallen angels that are now satyrs that have this kinship with sexuality and taking young women and nymphs, and are associated with caves. And in a lot of these rituals, you have these young women taken to these caves to satisfy these satyr gods.
Wow. That reminds me of the story of Demeter and Persephone. Her daughter was absconded with into the underworld by, I believe, Hades it was. Very much like this story here, so it's kind of interesting. You mentioned the Rock of the Gods. What was that again, real quick? I just took a real quick note about that. The Gate of Hell.
Oh, okay. So
you just kind of glossed over that.
Well, if you know the story of Jesus going to Caesarea Philippi, that's at the foot of Mount Hermon, and that's where he announced to the world that he was going to start his church on his rock. He changes
and the gates
the name
of, hell
of
will
Simon
not prevail.
to Peter. Yeah. And so at the foot, you've got a whole series of polytheist temples from all around the world. And that's where, the cave of the gateway to Hades is located. And that's also where the Pan Temple was built.
Wow.
That famous white dome building that looks a lot like Washington buildings. So anyways, that's more just the Greek architecture. But and of course, Pan is thought to be the god Azazel as well, and or a whole series of these degraded fallen angels from before the flood. But these gods would be after the flood, so it's like they're part of maybe that class, but they didn't maybe fully participate because they didn't go to the abyss, right? But after the flood, they still seem to have this association with the gateways to the underworld where the abyss would be. And they seem to sort of carry on in that kind of tradition as a satyr god. So it's interesting that you have this type of ritual done in presenting a lot of the offerings in a cave. I mean, it's spilled over to the streets, and they did, things like, whipping young females, and again, all sorts of stuff that was going on in it. And you can imagine that the goats that are being sacrificed are in honor of those goat gods, right? It's an honor in terms of giving worship and sacrifice and energy to these gods. And then whatever females that would have been delivered onto them into the caves obviously wouldn't be seen anymore after that. So, and then again, so you got those three levels. You've got what's going on for the gods, you've got what's going on for the priests and the adepts, and then you've got sort of the pablum sort of ritual for everybody else.
We have a quick question from the chat. Sorry to interrupt real quick. Hold your thought,
cool.
NBC. Take a note what you were going to say.
I already took note. I already
Good.
did.
Do you have a commentary or do you have anything written up about the Cave of Treasures? Is a question from April.
No, I do not.
Okay,
Sorry.
I don't know what it is, so I can't help with that. Okay, NPC, back to you.
So I just had a macabre epiphany. So it's the color pink that we associate with Valentine's Day. That's the mixture of blood and milk, like in the ritual. So that's pretty. Yeah. So think about that next time.
And they would drink it, right?
Gross.
And that's not an uncommon thing to be drinking blood in polytheist rituals. And in some rituals, let's say in Egypt, they used to have a mixture of blood and alcohol that they would drink that Hathor was famous for. And in other cultures as well, it's not uncommon to have a mixer, and particularly in a specific kind of ritual. And so the milk would be sort of back to that mother goddess type of thing. And that's probably the best way I could link it. It's kind of a linkage back to honoring also the mother goddess that's interwoven into this ritual as well.
It's definitely a witchcraft type of. Sorry, I will say it's a witchcraft thing that we've read about, especially like with the moon child and the blood. If you that group. Gosh, now I'm not going to think of their name, and it should be so easy. But anyway, they came out with an album called Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and that seemed like a cool thing at the time, and really it was very much pointing to part of the rituals that they do in Hollywood. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because, yeah, it is, you're right, it's well known that they get into the milk and the semen and the blood, and it's all part of these rituals with the witchcraft and or Satanism, whatever you want to call it. But, yeah, NPC, back to you.
Anyway, so I've heard about some other myths where the eating of flesh and drinking of blood was actually abhorrent to some of the other gods. So, for instance, like to use Ceres or Demeter again as an example, she was so forlorn that Persephone had been taken that she didn't notice that Tantalus had served the gods his son Pelops, right? And so she had eaten a little bit of him. But anyway, I was just curious, is there some type of contrast to the ethics of some of these fallen angels, as it were? Or?
No, they're not, because here's what people tend to forget about is that in that story about Demeter, we're talking about either an offspring of two gods, which would be a lower god, but a god nonetheless, or the offspring of a god and a female, which would be a demigod. So what they're upset about is they're sacrificing and eating their own as opposed to humans. And that's the distinction that people sort of forget about it, because it's just sort of blurred in terms of how we're to understand the story.
Well, that makes a lot more sense then, because, yeah, the giants did seem to have a penchant for eating humans. So I kind of notice that anytime I see these rituals, if you trace that back, you'll end up in some domain of a fallen angel or god or something like that.
Well, and in the upper levels, and and it does come from the Nephilim as blood drinking and eating humans as being, one of those crimes, and it's a ritual that had continued. And it seems to come from the gods as well, because they had like drinks like ambrosia and nymphy and other things that were, we're not sure what they were, but as you dig into the layers of it, particularly with the ambrosia one, it seems to be tied to blood drinking. So it seems like the gods needed something within the blood of humans and or animals to sort of help with that immortality, with that physical body in this physical world, because typically gods and angels are spirit beings, and they need to find a way to sort of keep that body alive. And when we look at what is going on with the sacrifices of all of the animals, typically that blood would run down the altars and into these collection tanks. Nobody ever talks about is where did that blood go after that? I think they probably went to the gods or to the priests and the adepts. And at that level, I think they were consuming massive amounts of blood afterwards, because they thought not only would it extend their life, it would give them more cognitive dissonance, not dissonance, I'm sorry, cognitive abilities that would, be part of that twofold aspect of immortality, which is, long life and all of the knowledge of the world. So you need to be able to handle that in terms of the learning, and that would be the twofold reasons they would be taking them.
I've actually read about this described as something called Amrita, and in Buddhist rituals, they'll assemble together what they call the 4 or 5 meats or something like that, and it's like the green horse and red human and a dog and something else, but there's human in there too. So they eat these, they like combine them all these different kingdoms into one serum, as it were, and then they consume that. I guess, yeah, it has some effect. Do you understand what it's doing to the person? Like what's going on there? Is this like activating some glands in them? Like, why do they do this stuff?
Well, everything that they do in the rituals are to emulate what the gods did, and so that they can become like gods. So you have to understand, it's like follow the money in polytheism, is this follow what makes them more godlike in terms of their belief system is. And so that comes from the gods that they worship. And so it must have something to do with long life and more cognitive abilities, because those are the two key things that seem to always be the central themes to polytheism.
And the false promises of Satan. He promises wisdom and long. He says you won't die, right? If you eat from the tree of knowledge.
Yeah. Well, and what a great deception that was, is you get to know good and evil, but now you're not permitted to eat from the tree of life. He didn't quite tell them the fine print that they were going to be ostracized from Eden. So they got knowledge of good and evil to go along with what they already knew, but they lost the complete immortality. So, from having access to the tree of life. So, yeah, it's
the devil's
but
in
that
the
is
details.
Those are in the details, yes. And what's in the fine details as well is there is no immortality in the physical world.
Amen. To loop back on to Lupercalia, back onto something earlier.
Good one.
I didn't realize it till I said it. So the Emperor Claudius, he was in reign during the time of Saint Valentine, correct? And I heard a story about how he banned marriage because he was trying to toughen up his armies. I guess he was going on these long, extended campaigns and stuff. So is there some type of it seems like the fertility aspects of this was very much pronounced, and I was wondering if that had a lot to also do with the fact that this is the end of the ecclesiastical year. also, because today is Adar 1, for instance. And so I was wondering, does this holiday, even though it's kind of associated with St. Valentine on one level, like you said, there's like the public level, and then there's the adept and others. But I was wondering, does this also kind of contrast with Purim, like the story of Esther? Because, on one hand we have and I guess we can get into the cave now again, because the cave was in Palatine Hill, I think, and that was one of the 7 hills that's mentioned in Revelation 17, I think. Where it talks about Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth. And we mentioned in a show before about how Lilith was actually in domain over Rome. So I was kind of wondering if maybe this holiday is kind of like Lilith's holiday in contrast to Purim, you know what I mean in that regard, I guess. I know I kind of stretched the question a long way. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there's a lot there to cover off. So let me back my way in it and sort of build up to it. And it starts with Cupid. So let's sort of start understanding
yes,
that.
let's talk about Cupid. We wanted to ask about that for sure.
Yeah. And Cupid is actually, he's referenced as Cupid, but he's actually the Roman god Amor. And Cupid means passionate or desire, and Cupido in Latin. And he's the god of desire and or erotic love. And erotic love is really defined as lust, as you dig back into what that meaning is, just as the fallen angels would lust after the beautiful sons of humans to create the Nephilim with. And in polytheist belief system, a demigod was an offspring of a god and a human female. So it means the same thing as Nephilim is talked about in Genesis 6. And he's depicted as a fallen angel with wings. So this is taking, again, that back into a little bit deeper history than what, typically would be understood and looked at. And what's interesting about that is that you have Amor and Cupid as being the son of the love goddess Venus. And Venus had her temple on Avatine Hill, and I'll get to Palatine in a second. But Venus is the mother goddess, parent god, and she's part of that original Queen of Heaven, parent god aspects, as opposed to the second tier offspring gods that kind of show up more after the flood. That are also called the Queen of Heaven. And so that's why Aventine Hill is a different hill than what is depicted with Cybele, with the Phrygian temple.
Goddess of destruction in the sea.
Yeah, which is at Palatine Hill. So, wow. And she was called the mother goddess as well. What is it? The Magna Mater or something. Magna Mater, I think, is the way they say it in Latin. But anyway, she's the mother goddess as well. And again, just to sort of connect one more hill in there, is that the Sibylline oracle prophecies, which is the Palatine sort of mythos, and that goes back to that Etruscan religion that was before Rome. And understand, again, as we talked about Rome, Romulus and Remus set up the 7 hills as the place where you were going to have like 7 sort of temples or palaces that were going to be the Roman city as it went forward. The Sibylline had a sort of a secondary and a branch temple on a different hill that is outside of the 7 hills. And that's another Etruscan hill of oracles and prophecies, which was the Vaticum with a cum at the end in terms of the Latinized name of it, where the Vatican was built on. So it's built on sort of the branch temple of the Sibylline Queen Mother religion of Palatine Hill, which is, really kind of interesting as you start to think about where that starts to connect in terms of the Bible and things like that, although we're probably, a bit too early to go into that. But I just wanted to sort of get that on the hill, on the table in terms of Cupid. And I mentioned that things sort of go back to Greek mythology as sort of the parents. So the gods that are in the Roman pantheon, they have a Greek equivalent that they tend to take most of their information on. And that would be the god Eros. And you'll like where I'm going, then I'll stop and we can start digging into some other things that you might be interested in. But Eros is also the god of love. And he's depicted amongst winged gods, just as Cupid or the Amor god is, and winged love gods. And of course, the original depictions of the Greek gods were all serpents, and they were more humanized as you got later on into history. But originally, if you go back to the most ancient ones, they're all depicted as serpents, just as the Watchers are the seraphim angels and the sons of God in Genesis 6. And those gods go back to a set of gods called the Erotes, which are part of the winged gods of love and sex. And you'll love this, like Hermaphroditus is also one of the names that comes out of one of those angels, and they've got all sorts of different names within that group. But this is seemingly talking about those seraphim watchers that went and created the original sort of Nephilim. So Eros is the son of Aphrodite and Ares, which is the war god, just as Amor or Cupid is the offspring of Venus and Mars, Mars being the war god, Venus being the queen mother, fertility goddess. And so you have that sort of connection. Now, also in the Roman history, though, you also have Vulcan that's involved here as well, that Venus was involved on, just so in case anybody's checking me on my mythology. So, but it was not unusual to have consorts between the gods, right? That was pretty common to have more than one partner. And so the Amori god of the Erotes is, they're known for not only earthly love and sex, but heavenly love and sex, whatever that means, or maybe that means sort of a merging of that. And so what we have going on here now is something that is overlaid onto the Valentine, onto the Lupercalia festival as well, that again, as you look at some of the gods, is taking this right back to what happened before the flood, and probably again right after the flood, with my preferred position is, in terms of how giants show up after the flood, is a second incursion. So it's really quite interesting how all of this has deeper meanings and goes in a number of different directions, which is why people get kind of confused on it. To finish off with Cupid, just sort of quickly, you don't see Cupid sort of overlaid onto this in the way that we sort of understand it today until about the 1500s or so. And it becomes part of that sort of troubadour sort of Grail writings and things like that, where it's about courtly love and things like that. And Shakespeare actually, and people shouldn't find this surprising if they know anything about Shakespeare, because all he does is talk about the gods and the genealogies of the gods and the dynasties and the people most important. And so in Midsummer's Night Dream, where you have all of these fairies and elves and all sorts of creatures in it, you've also got the winged Cupid being depicted in there. And there's another interesting fellow that was before that, in say late 1400s, early 1500s, Botticelli, who was also writing about Cupid being positioned and showing her above Venus. And he was funded by the Medicis, and he was also a Grand Master in the Priory of Sion, and also associated with introducing the early sets of tarot cards that people can trace when tarot cards came into Europe. He seems to be one of those sort of founding individuals, and he wrote about Cupid in a book called The Allegory of Spring. So you have this starting to overlay onto this feast of St. Valentine somewhere, let's say between 13 to 1500, that starts to morph into everything that we have today as we understand it. And even the idea of gifts, particularly with flowers and things, that has its history that goes back to the gods of the Egyptian pantheon, where the male would, on certain festival days, would bring all kinds of flowers for the goddess. So that's where I thought I would sort of get that on the table and get some discussion going around on those two aspects in terms of how far it starts to go back into other historical, mythological aspects and religions of those mythologies, and then how it sort of takes its momentum at sort of the starting point in somewhere around the Middle Ages.
Before we leave Cupid, I have one question that may be obvious or may not. And since it's not obvious to me, I'm going to ask it because I'm not afraid to be the only one asking. But Cupid is often portrayed as a child. And do you think there's some kind of, is this some kind of pedophilia stuff being intermixed, or is it something else entirely?
It has its roots in the Greek version. Again, that's why you need to sort of understand the Greek end of it and the Roman aspect of it. So Eros was originally sort of talked about in Greek mythology as being a boy. But of course he grows up. So, but that sort of boyish sort of thing, because he's the god of love, Eros, even from childhood, right? And he's not permanently a child. He's actually depicted also in accounts as being an adult. So it's it's kind of a bit odd that you would have a god that would grow up that way. But the thing that we always have to keep in mind about myths in polytheism is it's based on the cult of knowledge. It's based on mysticism. It's based on allegories. And so it's like a fairy tale. And the superficial tale is more interesting than it is truth. And the true meanings are understood by the adepts who understand the allegories that are embedded into the words into the superficial story. And so even though the superficial story is entertaining, you have to be an adept to fully appreciate what they're talking about. So why they would create both Cupid, even though he's also talked about as an adult as Amor, as the god of love and the son of Venus in the Roman pantheon, and again as a boy god in the Greek mythology and pantheon. Obviously, there is something there that is known at the adept level and probably practiced in some way at the ritual level. And the only thing I can think of is that's reflecting a preference for pedophilia, as you mentioned. Long story to answer it, but I didn't want to treat it as just a simple yes without context.
Sure. Okay, so back to you, NPC.
So you mentioned something about the knowledge cults. So I was just wondering, is that somehow connected to the whole idea of vril? Because I've also seen Amor used in the context with vril and a swan. And I was just wondering, because those stories that we mentioned earlier about the consorts of gods and goddesses. In a lot of cases, Zeus would change into animals and stuff like that. So it got me thinking, um, is this some type of amorous, energetic thing? Like, the pairing of two opposites generates this current of energy, and then that's what they were really trying to tap into for somehow. Is that making sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is, where you ended
So
up and where you started. So
what? Oh yeah. So basically, you said that this was connected to some type of knowledge cult. So I was just wondering, like, where they were just all seeking some type of gnosis through these acts they were doing? It wasn't really clear on like what it was they were aiming for.
well, the whole concept of mystery religions is gaining knowledge as you go up the various degrees.
Okay.
And gnosis, which is the root word for Gnosticism, means to know or knowledge. And they're all knowledge cults. And knowledge is one of those requirements, as there are two pillars for godhood: immortality and sort of unlimited knowledge. And so that's why they do these rituals. That's why they eat what they eat in the rituals. That's why they drink what they drink in the rituals, to help with those cognitive abilities to be able to take in that knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And get to the next kind of levels. And I always think about, when I think about, you use the word amour, that comes from amor, right? It's just Cupid's real name, or Amorini wine. And it's a terrific wine and a terrific grape, but that is rooted in that love festival in terms of the wines that they would have been drinking for those festivals. So typically those words that are used in products and things, that we associate all around the whole topic, have a root back into those gods, which means they were part of the ritual, and that's why they were named accordingly. Now, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, somebody in the chats used that common song lyric, when the moon hits your eye, like a big pizza pie, it's amore. I was actually just reading something here about Pan, how it said that one of his biggest conquests was to draw down the moon goddess Selene. He disguised himself as a lamb because he was a goat. So I thought that was kind of strange.
Well, and the moon is the queen of heaven. It is the fertility goddess, right? And the elixir of the moon goddess was drinking blood, and specifically menstrual blood, which is connected to the cycle of the moon. So everything, as you go deeper into the rituals, I mean, it's a complex set of interconnected meanings and things that people don't necessarily make the connections of, because we don't have the information and the language to normally make those kinds of connections.
Exactly.
Right. And so
language.
Yeah. And that's why they can get away with it in plain sight, because they know that we don't understand, for the most part, what they're talking about. But I think we've talked about on a lot of shows that it doesn't matter whether it's music, it doesn't matter whether or not it's movies, it doesn't matter whether or not it's literature, it doesn't matter whether it's poetry. You have this millennial of sort of a practice and a mode that they are writing about stories for themselves that they can understand. And I'm talking about the elite, who always controlled the humans because they were the relatives of the kings, which are the bloodlines of the Nephilim, and they had that feudal system set up for the priest class and the ruling class and the warrior class that was all for them. And so that's why all the literature is loaded and all the entertainment is loaded with their allegories and embedded codes and pictures, because they're doing it for themselves. They're doing it as culture, for the arts, not for the mundane humans. And that's why when people go in and they look at a painting, They're trying to understand what the artist is trying to communicate. What's the true meaning? And for them, that would be part of that taciturn language that they would be looking for. What are the occult things that are in there that this painter is trying to communicate to me?
We do have a
Yes,
question from the
symbolism.
chat. I hope you don't mind if I break up this, and it's a little off topic, but it's all connected. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask the question from the chat, Gary. It's from Will, and he says, "Who is the highest ranking female demon?" He thought you would know that.
As a demon, well, the word demon, Will, is, as you know, is an interesting word. Typically, demon kind of is used for fallen angel, but it shouldn't be. So a demon would be sort of an offspring of a god and a human female to create a Nephilim or a hero or one of the various known giants around the world. So depending on how somebody wants to define Lilith, is she kind of a god as she's described in some accounts, or is she more of a demon or a demigod? And she is very much considered part of that whole ideology of the Queen of Heaven as well in some parallel streams. So, but she is the offspring of the gods, so within the physical world. So if the gods actually had offspring to produce god sons and daughters, then that typically would also be classified as a demon as well, as opposed to a fallen angel, if I was clear on that. So from that perspective, I would suspect that that would be the top level of the female demons.
Thank you for answering that question. So NPC, I'm probably on the edge of about to say something and I interrupted, so my apologies. Go ahead.
It's fine. I always got something to say. So basically, it seems like all these mystery religions are connected to goddesses for the most part, and one of them that I keep seeing come up is Inanna, and I remember her being actually a prominent Anunnaki, known for love and war, actually. So she also bore that title, I think, Queen of Heaven, and she was known for being like an ace fighter pilot in her spaceship and all this. Just really fascinating stories around her, but I just see that name come up a lot. It eventually ends up at Inanna.
Yeah, so Queen of Heaven, Inanna, if you break that word down, you have Nan, meaning woman and or lady in Sumerian, and An, which means sky. And so her name literally is communicating Queen of Heaven as a title that she was known. So there's an ancient tablet that's called the Venus tablet of Amnisaduqa, if I've pronounced that correctly and remembered it correctly. And in it, she quotes herself as being, "I am Inanna, Queen of Heaven." And so Inanna, though, is seemingly more of from the offspring gods and more closely related with Enlil and Enki as opposed to Anu, which is the parent god of the Sumerian one. But she is very much understood as the Queen of Heaven, at least after the flood. And so in all of the different pantheons, you have the Queen of Heaven that is the original parent gods. And we really don't get a good answer in terms of why you have parent gods and you have offspring gods, and how do the offspring gods actually overthrow the parent gods? And if they did that, where did they go? Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but that's the general sort of consensus. I actually think it makes more sense that the parent gods were the original angelic fallen angels before the flood, and they're the ones who went to the abyss first. So if you read in Gnostic Gospel, that's called the Pistis Sophia, it actually describes these fallen angels that are in the abyss, and it sounds very much like the parent gods and what happened before the flood. And if that's the case, then after the flood, you would have had other gods that are taking over from the parent gods to replace them, to be ruling from the council of gods that Psalm 82 describes to us. And that's typically, the Baalim as we kind of understand it, I am being the plural. So the council that Baal reigns over, and the additional ones would be the I am plural, the Baalim. That's why you've got Baalim in places like Philistines as opposed to Baal. It's just so people understand what the Bible is kind of talking about. And so I think you get gods, goddesses then after the flood that are also going to be sort of the queen of heaven as well. So as we talked about before, you had Venus before the flood in the Roman pantheon, and then afterward you would have had Cybele as being the mother goddess after the flood. So if you had, let's say, Inanna or Astarte or Isis as being those parent gods after the flood, then you would have had another god, let's say in the Egyptian pantheon, like Nut, which would be a parent god and considered one of the queens of heaven, and then you would have had a similar one in the Sumerian pantheon as well. So you almost have that title being passed on, I guess, is what I'm talking about in kind of a lengthy way, but I just want to sort of give people an understanding in terms of how to make sense of all of these sort of almost seemingly conflicting things that come out of polytheism. So they seem to inherit that title as inheriting the same positions and the same pantheon and the same organizational structure after the flood. So when we see in Jeremiah 7 and 4, chapter 7 and 44, you actually have the people of Judah, the southern kingdom of that time, doing rituals and sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven. That's who they're sacrificing to, is the Queen of Heaven that took the title after the flood, and that would have been very much like Astarte, as opposed to maybe Ishtar that might be before the flood.
That's really fascinating. Oh, and I found the link for the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, and I shared that in the chat. So thank you for enlightening me. I'd never heard of that before.
Did I get the pronunciation right?
You were pretty close. I was able to put it in Google, or not Google, but DuckDuckGo. I was able to find it.
I was trying to remember the word in my mind, so that's why I was slowly, as I was starting to enunciate it.
Oh yeah, those Anunnaki words are rough. Also, I found a link a little bit ago. I'd shared it as well. It was Vagitanus, or one of these other variations of Vaticanus, and you'd mentioned cherubs and little babies as angels, Aaron. Well,
Right.
This particular goddess is associated with crying infants, and so I thought it was kind of strange, seeing how we're coming up on that 1260-day period since the birth in Revelation 12. Some say that would be March 6th. So again, to have this kind of holiday surrounding, something like that, I just think that's really strange, because it almost seems like the people that wrote the Bible were really referencing all of these things that were going on, and they're being like, hey, these are all a bunch of false gods, folks, and they were using all that symbolism to basically tell their story. But yeah, we're so far removed, like you said, because we don't have the language. It's hard for us to really perceive that. So I had a question. Do you think that, in the Revelation, it talks about the return of these entities or such? So we're going to have people maybe getting these titles again, but maybe doing it in secret and we just don't know it. And so, we have a Queen of Heaven already prancing around somewhere that maybe is possessed by this spirit. Is that, do you see it actually playing out like that? Because in my mind, that's how I see it.
Yeah, the Queen of Heaven, Mother Goddess, is coming back as part of the Babylon religion, and if you understand the ancient structure of the religion, you always had, as part of the duality, And polytheist religions are called dualist religions for a number of reasons and allegories. One of them is that they have an equal male and female god and goddess. And so, these Queen of Heaven goddesses are, a lot of times married to a war god and also a war goddess themselves. So very, very powerful. And it was one of the most important aspects of the ancient religion. So in the Bible, we would understand that as the daughters of Babylon, as being those religions of the female Queen of Heaven, Mother Goddess, which was a most significant part of that religion. And so one should expect that that is coming back in the end time. And what's really interesting is that, in Zechariah, we actually have two female angels, even though people don't recognize them necessarily as angels. But they are females with wings, and they are taking the basket for the ephah to be set between heaven and earth. And they're going to set it down in Shinar, which is Babylon. And you have this mother figure in Revelation 17 that rides the seven empires. This is the daughter of Babylon. This is the Babel religion. This is Mystery Babylon. This is the religion that controlled all of the beast empires and all of the extended empires. Any polytheist run kingship and dynasty had that religion as part of that organizational structure. And that's why you have Mystery Babylon, who is and mystery can be understood in two different ways. I mean, mystery can be like a secret or something, but it also is the word for mystery religions as being holding hidden things, holding secrets, initiations and rituals. That's the Greek word mysterion. And it's very important to understand the descriptions that Revelation 17 is talking about if you're going to understand the full aspect of what Mystery Babylon is in the end time. But this is the mother goddess. This is the Queen of Heaven that is talked about in the Old Testament that says there is none like me. And that's exactly what Babylon is talking about in the end time. And so this universal religion is that ancient religion that's coming back, that is in place before the start of the last 7 years, which permits and is the glue and is the accelerant that brings about the 10-king empire out of Rome, that will make the way for Antichrist at the midpoint of the last 7 years. Antichrist in Revelation 17 actually destroys Babylon and replaces that religion with a religion of his own to worship himself and Satan for the last 3.5 years. But that's how the end time will come about, is through this mystery religion. So it's important that we understand that.
Wow, you just really highlighted something important. Because, it does talk about that in Revelation 17, how the 10 kings will actually they'll hate the whore and destroy her. So that's really interesting to note, because it makes it, you almost want to think that they're all just in cahoots together. But one thing to note about the fallen are that they can never get along, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
when
the
we
elites
understand,
fight. Sorry.
they do. They always do. And those 10 kings are going to hand their power over to Antichrist. You have to understand that Babylon is a city, number one, and it's said to be a city 9 times in Revelation 14, 17, and 18. So we know it's a city. We know she sits on many waters as a religion. And I'll get into the religion aspect in a second, as the waters are defined at the end of Revelation 17 as many peoples, nations, and tongues. So we know it's a worldwide thing. It is a geopolitical organization because it's the one that controls the empires and rides the empire, as in using reins, as in governing and controlling, and will be again. And that's why those 10 kings who are subservient to this mother goddess religion that's coming back, they'll grow jealous of how rich she is and conspire with Antichrist to destroy her. And she's also a commercial organization, because Babylon grows rich by controlling all of the trade. And when she's destroyed, all of the merchants around the world are horrified because there's no more trade. She controls all of that. And expect, as we get closer to the end time, that Babylon, when it comes to power, is going to lap onto what's already put in place and put it on steroids, what I would call the apocalyptic taxes that we're starting to see in things like the carbon taxes, and that if we don't pay for something through taxes, that we're going to be destroyed from the face of the earth. So expect more of those taxes. It's actually going to be like a tribute, like a value-added tax on every transaction that's made in the world. And that's how she grows wealthy. And that's exactly what the globalists are planning. So expect that to come about. So you've got those 4 different aspects as to what Babylon is. Not just, too many people look at Babylon as just one of those things or 2 of those things. No, it's all of that, if you really want to understand it. And if you get into the allegories of it, why we know it's a religion, you get that word, she's the great mother of harlots, and great is the word, Greek word megas, which means, great from an external form, from appearance and size, and in age, which is really important to understand, and also in rank and authority. So we have to understand the language on this. And a whore is a prostitute, which is an allegory for idolatry, and also an allegory for Babylon and for Rome. And the woman that's talked about is, denoting that female aspect to this mother goddess religion. And Babylon is not only meaning Babylon city and Babylon empire of King Nebuchadnezzar, but it's also representing and is rooted in the Hebrew word for Babel. So it's that religion that crossed the flood, that began before the flood, that was brought to Nimrod as part of his rebellion, that is what is being talked about here for the daughters of Babylon and the Babylon religion. We need to understand prehistory to understand what this religion is going to be all about. And Babylon, as you take that back into its Greek format, is also an allegory for Rome, just as First Peter is thought to be talking about Rome from where he's writing from in the letter in 1 Peter 5:13. And harlot is the word porn, Porne in Greek, and I'm not making that up.
Oh, geez, of course.
Of course, right? And also that means a whore and a harlot and idolater, and again, an allegory for Rome, as it's defined. And so Babylon is the mother of harlots and of abominations, which is also idolatry. And as I said, it's the mystery Babylon, which is mysterion, which is hidden things and secrets, as in a mystery religion, as in the polytheist religions and the secrets given to the initiates. And this is the universal religion that is coming, that is going to sit on 7 hills. Now, you got 7 hills in Constantinople, and you've got 7 hills in Rome, which would be the 2 most possible candidates. But Rome is the capital city of the ancient Roman Empire, which is the empire that is rising out of the ashes to become a global empire. So it makes sense that the talk is about Rome, and that these 7 hills are those 7 hills that include, Aventine Hill and Palatine Hill, and I won't go through all the different names of the hills, and that the Vatican is going to be a significant part of it, as being sort of that branch hill that it may be the epicenter, which will then reach out to the rest of the world, but it will be a polytheist reinvented Catholic universal religion coming out of the Vatican Hill and back to its home center at Palatine Hill, where the original Sibylle temple was. So when we look at the different aspects as to where and who and what this end time Babylon is going to be, there's a strong likelihood that it's going to be centered in Rome again, because it's the revived Roman Empire, and Revelation seems to talk about that. And where people get confused is that they say, well, no, it says the seven are seven kings. No, that's not what it says. It says it is seven hills, which are mountains, and temples were usually put on hills and mountains. And it is, and I'll just back up a step, it's seven mountains, and it also says, and it is seven kings. And those seven kings are the seven empires of the beast empires that she rode. So you've got the four that are mentioned in Daniel, and then you have the fifth one that's coming in the end time. Antichrist is the eighth king for the new religion and the eighth empire at the midpoint. And then the other two that aren't mentioned in Daniel are ones that happened before the time of Daniel, but would have had a significant effect on Israel somehow, some way. That tends to be Egypt, where they were enslaved, and they were a huge empire and the most powerful empire of that time. And either Assyria and Babel, which of course Assyria comes out of Nimrod, so it's probably intermixed on that. And of course, that is the home sort of basis to understand what the Babylon religion of the end time is. And of course, Nimrod was a typical Antichrist archetype who forced on the people this mystery religion and enforced it through tyranny, and was sort of, again, giving us all of the kind of details that we need to understand to look forward to with what's being talked about in the end time with Revelation 17. I know that was a bit of a rant, but I get on a roll sometimes.
Well, real quick, you mentioned the hills, and NPC, didn't you want to bring up something about one of the hills specifically?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the cave earlier, and there was one particular one that was associated with Valentine's Day in particular, and I think we talked about it as being Palatine Hill, and then there was a couple of others that I think were, and you mentioned an eighth hill. So when you mentioned that the Antichrist was the eighth, it made me think of that eighth hill, but I don't remember if we were talking about the eighth hill before we went live, or if that was something you mentioned after. But did you know the name of the eighth one?
Well, it's going to not be in Rome, because Rome is completely destroyed. What we do know is in Revelation 11 is after the two witnesses are killed, and this is at the time when Antichrist is taking power. It's called Sodom and Jerusalem, where they're being killed. And he's crowned in Jerusalem. He's going to move his mountain to Jerusalem, and where the temple is on the Temple Mount there. And of course, there'll be obviously a wing, as overspreading is defined as, for the Hebrew people in the first 3.5 years, the Jewish people to start their sacrifice. And Antichrist ensures that in Daniel 9:27, when he creates the covenant for the world and the covenant for Israel and their assured protection, he will ensure that they can have the sacrifice before he takes it away at the midpoint. But that's really the eighth hill, is that mountain there. And it's sort of the allegory for Mount Hermon. And how I sort of get around about that is that in Deuteronomy 4, verse 27 or 28, or no, 48 or 49, Hermon is also called Mount scion. Now this word scion is where the Priory of Sion sort of gets its meaning from, and I won't go too far down that rabbit hole. But this is Mount Hermon, and one of the sort of and Shinir is another one, and there's another version still, but it's the Sion one we want to keep our eye on. It's not the same word as Mount Zion as you take that back to Hebrew, but it's going to be that sort of allegory that they're going to be setting up in Mount Zion, which is typically known as Jerusalem in the mountain in Jerusalem, in the Temple Mount. That's the pantheon of gods that they're going to establish back in Jerusalem, and it's kind of an interesting double entendre and play on words. But Jerusalem is going to be the eighth hill.
Oh man, that's really fascinating, because scion is a gardening term, and you mentioned earlier about how maybe Rome would try to be a branch, and so I could see them trying to like copy scripture in these ways by just having these names of
They
things.
will. They absolutely will. They've, and particularly in the English language, where they've embedded a lot of the words, and people have to be careful of that. They should be using the original Hebrew words for those names, but they're using words of their design. Now, the scion that you're talking about is S-C-I-O-N. And again, that has a double entendre as well. So scion, and the one I was talking about is S-I-O-N in Deuteronomy, and that is the French transliteration of the Latin word Zion that comes from Hebrew, Z-I-O-N. And so they've totally transposed it, right? And it's not, and it doesn't go back to the same word Sion as it comes out of Hebrew. It's a completely different word. And so the Sion you're talking about is S-C-I-O-N, which means sort of grafting on branches, and or is the first son of a bloodline. And also that is the word that they like to use in the occult bloodlines of when you graft or ennoble another bloodline with another ennoble bloodline to make it even higher in their cult. That's called scioning as well.
Okay, that's a really good time for me to segue into a question that somebody had. And so hold any thought that you might have had for just a second, NPC. We had a question. Cool. We have two questions that's all related. I'll never say it's unrelated. But first, I wanted to get to Barbara's question. She says, speaking of bloodlines, she said, our family did not know about Rh negative blood type until our daughter became pregnant with her first child. This means they didn't even know this was a thing. To our shock, we read the horror stories of mothers with this blood type whose bodies can reject their own child and attack them involuntarily because of the Rh negative blood. Would this be a confirmation of serpent seed line in the mother, with the explanation being that Satan is attempting to purify the bloodline? Or is all of this discussion conjecture, giving praise and attention to Lucifer rather than our Father, God the Creator? Her son is also Rh negative. Now there are two in the family.
So if people want to get a document on Rh negative, get a hold of me. I do have a document on that. In my book, I don't specifically mention Rh negative bloodline because I don't really have specific evidence that sort of speaks to the veracity that we know this would be the blood that would be added to the human bloodline by fallen angels through the Nephilim. Having said that, when you look at, let's say, the Windsor family, for example, and the royals there, they're all OH negative. Most of the royal bloodlines are Rh negative. And it's important to understand that they believe, and they have the genealogies that take those bloodlines back to specific Nephilim, whether or not it's Albion in the England area, which is the Albigen's bloodline, or it's to several Nephilim, and or to one specific fallen angel or god, or a number of ones, as those bloodlines have been scioned in over the generations. But that's where they fit in sort of the whole kind of hierarchy of the royal bloodlines. So it's what they believe with it that's important, what they do with that belief that's important. Now, as far as Rh negative goes, when somebody says it's been added into the human bloodline, the critics will come along and say, well, Rh negative is missing an antigen, and that's why it's negative. So how can you add something when something's being taken away? Well, that's misinformation in terms of how they've twisted it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it's the bloodline that's passed on. It's another term that they like to use that's called the spark of the divine and the gene of Isis. And when they talk about the spark of the divine, that's when, like the Bushes, who really made the term famous, 1,000 points of light, that's what they're referring to. Now, the gene of Isis is what's passed on because it's the genes that dictate the bloodline. And so it's not being added through a bloodline, it's being added through a gene, which of course makes sort of scientific sense. And also in the document, and I won't go into it now, it'll talk about why it doesn't always show up in every individual of a family, and that's a bit of a complicated thing to walk through, and I'm not a doctor, but I got it on paper. So if you want some information on that, just get a hold of me. I'll send that document to you or anybody else who asks for it. So what we're really talking about here is there's a strong likelihood that is the bloodline of the Nephilim. And there's a lot of people out there saying, okay, well, what about Jesus having that Rh negative bloodline? Well, we really don't have any evidence of that. We have occult people suggesting that they may have evidence of that, but that's going to probably be a lie. So everything sort of all points to that's why you have and again, I mean, when I got married and had to be blood tested, I asked why. What the heck are you guys talking about? And they said, well, certain blood types can't marry. I'm going, what does that mean? Nobody could give me an answer. It's just that, and so until I started digging into these kinds of things, I didn't understand what that was all about. And only recently, with medication and things that they can provide now, that they can permit those types of marriages. But it's
wow.
it was until a generation ago, it was something that was, you just couldn't get married if you both weren't Rh negative. If one was negative, it was going to be a problem.
That's so interesting. As far as I understand it, the the Rh negative is so rare too, and to have it just pop up in your family like hers did, that's so curious, and it would be interesting to read
It's
it.
the genes. Yeah, it's definitely the genes and how it can pass on. And only 15% of the population
Right.
has Rh negative blood.
Right.
And you get heavy pockets of it in Europe, particularly in the French area, where you had that conglomeration, as my book talks about, is that epicenter of these bloodlines that were popping up. And they can hit as high as 25% Rh negative in that area. But the people who have the most highest negative are the Basques.
Right.
And people might be familiar with the Basque diaspora. And it was a war between the bloodlines where the Basques were basically pushed out. And the Basques said is that they felt that it was done against them because they had the superior bloodline. And in the Basque belief system, in terms of their mythology and history, and I'll let people for themselves to decide whether they think it's myth or history, they say they are the species of Homo Atlantis, and that they settled Egypt and Scythia and Sumeria and northeast Spain after the flood. So when the bloodlines moved in out of the Middle East, as the nations spread out, they had inferior grade of bloodlines, but there became a power struggle, so you had the Basque diaspora.
Let me give my researched opinion real quick, because Barbara and her daughter are both listening, and her daughter is the one I believe that was RH negative. And then and I know your answer to this, Gary, because I've listened to you enough to know, but I have an opinion, and it's researched, but there is also what's called RH null. And you mentioned, well, how can you have RH negative if it's not there? Well, RH is still inserted in the genetics. Like you said, it's in the genes. The RH is there. Whether it's positive or negative can show up at any time. But RH null is no RH in the genetics. And I wonder, and it's an opinion of mine possibly, that is the original um, pure bloodline because the RH has been inserted and it is called RH for rhesus monkey. I don't know because for whatever reason, and Gary, my research is so limited compared to yours, so you might say, Aaron, what are you talking about? But the Rh negative is what it seems that the elite bloodline wants to keep, but I wonder if that isn't the RH isn't somehow the serpent seed maybe inserted. But the question that I would like you to answer to Barbara and her daughter to clearly put their mind at ease, a person with an Rh negative is not a person that cannot be saved. There, even if someone might be of Nephilim bloodline or it's in the genetics or whatever that means, there's certainly salvation for them as well.
That's what I believe in. I know not everybody agrees with that, but my belief is that anybody who on faith accepts Jesus and God and Jesus as your Redeemer, his sacrifice covers all the sins of the world except for willful violations against the laws of creation that seem to be tied into the meaning as it's talked about in the New Testament in Matthew about sins against the Holy Spirit, and that the Holy Spirit provides life. And so I suspect the connection is that violation that the angels did, creating immortal spirits of heaven in physical bodies in the physical world, which you're not supposed to mesh the two, as the book of Enoch talks alike. But if you don't willfully change your genetic makeup, or if you don't worship Antichrist and Satan in the last 3.5 years, or take the mark, which I think will also alter your DNA, then you have no worries on that. Coming by our physical bodies innocently, we are not responsible for that. We are not responsible for the sins of our fathers in the new covenant. And even though in the old covenant you might make an argument to the fourth generation, we are free from that. So my opinion is absolutely it has nothing to do with whether or not you will have salvation or not.
All right. Thank you for taking a side step on that. It is important. It was a good question, and people do ask that. They wonder, do I have a Nephilim bloodline, and am I not able to be saved, have salvation? So thank you for that. I want to go back to NPC again for another few minutes, and then I'll have one more kind of off-topic question for you, Gary, before we close.
Sure. Hey, somebody in the chat made a comment. Intrigued me. I've never read this before. He says a tribe of giants did in fact serve King David and worshiped Hashem. Does that ring any bells for you, Gary? Were there any giant tribes that actually served under David? Because I know that they didn't kill the Gibeonites. They made a treaty with them under Joshua, so they might have been still in the land, I guess. Are you there?
There's a couple. Oh, yeah, I was just waiting for you to finish. There's a couple lanes in there. So first of all, that word gibberim you have to be careful with, because it doesn't always mean giant, as in David's mighty men, right? But there might have been a couple in there that were part of Nephilim or Rephaim blood types. So you've got like Hittite in there and another one, and it escapes me. I can't quite come up with the name, but there's a couple there, and somebody wants to get a hold of me, I've got some information on that for you documented down. The other group is the Gibeonites. And so this is the tribe that made a treaty with Joshua in the time of the conquest and deceived Joshua. But God upheld the covenant anyways, the treaty, because what Joshua did, God locked in place. What people don't know is that the Gibeonites but they became the servants of the temple. So those descendants would serve David as being servants in the temple. Now, the Gibeonites aren't Canaanites. The Gibeonites, as talked about in Joshua, are Hivim, and Hivim are Rephaim. And so when you get into the account in the book of Joshua, it will interchange that name a couple of times as Hivim and Gibeon being the same people. And again, if people want to get a hold of me on that, I've got a document on the Gibeonites and how it connects into the time of Esther. So yes, there's definitely some
What?
there's
The
definitely
Star of Esther.
I knew that would get you excited, NPC.
There's the Star of Rephaim is the Seal of Solomon's star, or the symbol. Can you just make a comment about that, please, a little more? Just throw me a bone, man.
in terms of Esther.
Esther and the star.
So
That's what Esther means, right?
Yeah, well, the Star of David, that doesn't come about until the Kabbalists and the Rosicrucians overlay it into the Jewish movement in the 1800s. That had nothing to do with them. That's an occult symbol. That's just another example of how they take over everything with their iconology. But there's a group of people called the Nethinim that are talked about in the book of Esther, and those are the Gibeonites.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I thought it was awfully strange how they were still allowed to live, but then, like you said, they were bound by because Joshua was supposed to be doing certain things, which he wasn't even allowed to really speak the law. He could only write it on stones and things like that. So for his word to be used in that way, like it had to be binding. So maybe that was why he wasn't allowed to talk a lot of times. I don't know.
Yes, one would want to be very careful with your words if you understood what you were implementing, where it's going to be bound and forever by God.
Yeah, I actually think about that a lot. I try to not speak idly. It says you'll be judged for every idle word, right? You mentioned earlier about the winged ladies carrying the ephod to heaven. It was around the time he was talking about Shinar and Babylon. Were those Lilu or those pictures we see of like the women with wings and owl's feet? Is that what you were characterizing there earlier?
Did we lose Gary?
I don't know.
That was my fault. That was I was having a drink of water and I was on mute. Sorry about
that. You're allowed to drink water, no problem.
Because in the Bible it talks about the birds diving down on the sacrifice and stuff, so it kind of made me think of that too.
Yeah, I was referencing Zechariah, the book of Zechariah, with those two female with wings. But if you think about goddesses, now obviously it's taking a gender in a physical form in the physical world, but then so are these two angels that come from God, and they're definitely females, and they have wings, and they're placing this basket, the ephod, between heaven and earth in Shinar for Babylon. And it's very much connected to the Revelation 17 prophecy. But if we think about fallen angels in the polytheist pantheon and the mother goddess, and if we look at images of female goddesses, and a lot of times they have wings, right? Because they're fallen angels, and so they took a female form. And when you look at the Lilu that you're talking about, which Lilith is directly connected with, those are obviously fallen angels, whether or not parent ones or offspring ones, and however you want to look at that occult hierarchy, they are very much the same type of being, just the rebellious ones. I guess this is the simple way of putting it.
This is just fascinating. I'm really leveling up tonight, Gary.
And
He-
and also think about it. And also think about it this way. So I've talked about patriarchs and matriarchs in terms of the bloodlines and the allegories, and that the dragons and the ravens as the male patriarch, and they have wings as Anunnaki type of gods or seraphim type of gods. So when you look at the owls and the fairies for the female allegory they like to use, well, fairies have wings, and these are the fairy gods, and like Diana was the fairy god as an example, and thought to be the same god as Danan and Tuatha Danan, and or Danu, which is Anu. There's two different histories on that, so it's probably both. And she's also related, and just as Lilith is the other matriarchal allegory as owl. Like you have owls are always associated with Lilith, and owls are associated with like secret societies like the Bohemian Grove. So when you have the Bible that has the screech owl in Isaiah, and you take that back to Hebrew as Lilith, is you have that root word that's connected to it, and these screech owls are connected to dragons and satyrs and all of these other creatures that show up in Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 34. One is for the destruction of Babylon, and one is for the end time Armageddon war. These are actualities and realities out of ancient history. And if we understand in the end time that not all of the angels are in the abyss, and that they're going to become more interactive before the end time, and that the last 7 years is in the last 7 years by the end time that I'm referring to with that, and that the mother goddess religion of Babylon is coming just before that, we're going to see these things before the last 7 years. And then you have Revelation 9 being opened up somewhere in the first 3.5 years. And ultimately, there'll be the war that becomes a counterfeit Armageddon that Antichrist rides to being the false Messiah on. And then you have Revelation 12 when you have the rest of the angels that are thrown down to the heaven, that everybody's going to be there. So that's why at the destruction of Babylon at the midpoint of the last 7 years, and then at Armageddon, which is Isaiah 13 and 34 respectively, you have those creatures that are dancing around because they're seeing the destruction of humankind.
So, okay, I got a couple short questions then. So, this Revelation 9 king you mentioned, is this also the one that the 10 give their power to destroy the whore? And I was just curious because
in part
you mentioned, yeah, okay. So, because I've always wondered, is that the Antichrist or is that some other king? Because I wondered if that was maybe Asmodeus, or Asmodeus rather.
So we know that Antichrist is mortal because he is going to receive a fatal head wound, and that's in Revelation 13. And one expects a counterfeit resurrection because he needs to counterfeit everything Jesus did to be Jesus, right? And just needs to reinvent the time frame of Jesus' coming as he falsifies that. So the one in Revelation 17 that's talked about as the eighth king, which is understood as Antichrist, is also talked about as being the one who comes up out of the abyss. That is, now is not, but will be again. And the one that was, now is not, but will be again. And this is the time that's being talked about in the time of John, who wrote down the vision. So this individual isn't there then, but he will be coming. And in Revelation 11, the one who kills the two witnesses is the one who comes up out of the abyss. And the one who comes out of the abyss is Abaddon and Apollyon, which is the king, who is the leader of all of these creatures that are coming up out of the abyss. So what we're looking at is a combination of Antichrist and this individual, even though we also have Antichrist receiving his power from the dragon. And typically we understand the dragon as being Satan, and in sort of what I would call an avatara effect, as it's talked about in the occult. And as what I'm talking about with that is the Antichrist is going to be an incarnation, just as Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu, and Narasimha was an incarnation of Shiva as one of their many incarnations. An incarnation or an avatar provides extra power and influence and wisdom and knowledge to the person that is a symbiotic relationship as opposed to a demon possession. So it's done by a fallen angel to enhance the power. And we know Satan can do that because he entered into Judas to help him get over the hump of betraying Jesus, right? And so it took that to sort of help him over the hump. So we know that that's a possibility. So there's a connection then between Antichrist, Satan, and this individual that comes up out of the abyss, as Revelation 17 infers. And Antichrist is called the son of perdition. And the son of perdition, perdition goes back to the Greek word. It's a series of words, but Apollyon is it basically goes back to. And Apollyon, of course, is one of the names meaning destroyer, just as Shiva is a destroyer god from the Greek, and Abaddon in Hebrew. And we also know Antichrist is going to honor a god of forces in the book of Daniel, god of fortresses. And that's the Hebrew word Maus. And Maus is rooted in several words, but Az as an as, and Az as an azaz was meaning fortresses and strong, and Ez, which is meaning a goat, and all of those words are part of the same series of words that produces Azazel, who I think Abaddon and Apollyon is. So I think he's going to be adding power somehow as well to Antichrist as being the son of perdition. So there's a connection there, and I think it's that avatar effect, both by Satan and by Azazel, and Azazel being the king that comes out of the abyss, because he's the one who destroyed the antediluvian world and is the scapegoat that is talked about in Leviticus 16, and that is the Hebrew word Azazel. And he's the one who was the destroyer god of the earth. He taught the world, according to the book of Enoch, taught the world the art of war. He introduced the concept of war. He introduced weapons and the technology to make weapons. He's the one who paraded as the leader the antediluvian world into the apocalypse by water, and is coming back to do something similar for the apocalypse by fire.
Okay.
That's very interesting. That relates kind of like to the behemoth and Leviathan. Oh, pardon, Aaron.
Oh, that's okay. I have a question I want to get to before we finish from the chat, if that's all right. So that's why I broke in there.
By all means.
So Chach says, was hell or Sheol created as a part of the foundations of the world, aka Earth? Was that created during the creation of Earth, or as part of a foundation of it?
I think would be created as a part of the whole. So I understand the foundations of the earth were created forever. So one would expect then that what was built on top of it could be destroyed and replaced, but the foundations are forever. So one would expect that you would have had the underworld or Sheol as being part of that, as it's located within the earth as we understand it, but likely in another dimension. So that would have had to have been created together. And we need to understand the word hell is a horrible term that conflates three different things that shouldn't be out of Hebrew and Greek into the English language. So hell is made up of three different aspects. One being the abyss, where the fallen angels and the worst of the Nephilim are. And if you want to read a little bit more, well, how I know some of the Nephilim are in there, or the Rephaim, both actually. They're in the sides of the abyss prisons, as Ezekiel 31 and 32 talk about. So go read that. And if you're confused on it, get a hold of me. I've got a series of documents on that will walk you through it, including the trees of Eden, which is another interesting metaphor that they have in there. So the abyss is part of that in the earth in another dimension. And it's in the underworld, which is Hades or Sheol, as we understand it, coming out of Hebrew. So it's the larger portion of the underworld that the abyss is in. So two different kind of locations, both the abyss being inside of Sheol. The lake of fire is another place. And that's where obviously the fallen angels are going to first, followed by Satan and those who are judged in the second death to go to the lake of fire. And those who go with Antichrist and the false prophet at the end of the last 7 years. They, by the sounds of it, would probably go to the lake of fire, just as the false prophet and Antichrist go directly to the lake of fire.
Okay, so that's all the questions I have from the chat or from beforehand. So we've got a few minutes left, NPC, if you want to get any last thoughts or questions out, and we'll close up.
So recently I was learning about the little bags and pine cones that the Anunnaki would carry around. And when you were mentioning the basket that those women would carry into heaven, I was wondering, is that what those are? Would they somehow take those and carry them up to fertilize trees or something? Or is that really a euphemism?
You would think that term would be used in other applications. I've not really found one that's a direct link. It's interesting that you raised the bag, or the pine cone, as people like to call it. I find it a little bit different in terms of what I see, in terms of what's going on that. And typically, where you see those two images, that pine and the bag, it's they're Anunnaki who are lined up around this sort of almost like technological tree of life or something. Whatever it is, it's an important sort of tree, but it's got this sort of artistic license to it. So I think it's some sort of technology that they were interacting with, whether or not they get knowledge, they get power, whatever it is. It seems to be something like that, but it's also being part of a ritual. And so you have this bag and this so-called pine cone. I think both are technology, and that bag is going to interact with whatever that tree thing is, and that pine cone, I think, is more of a crystal, because crystal is always part of ancient technology and memory capabilities and other things. And to me, that looks like more of a large crystal than a pine cone. I'm just not sure what a pine cone would have to do with it, but if people think it's a tree, I suppose, but why would you insert a pine cone into a tree? But if you're dealing with technology, then I think whatever is in that bag is sort of designed to be interactive with that technology, as well as the crystal.
You're right. I always see them they're always sporting those bracelets with a flower icon on them. And
Yep.
I'd say that they have to wear, because when you read about them, they have the tablets of destiny and this, that, and the other. And I think they had to have several pieces of technology to be able to really exert their influence, however it is they did it.
It is. And those things might have something to do with interdimensional things too, right? I mean, with that technology. So in some of the traditions, all of the knowledge of the world isn't on the emerald tablets, it's in sapphires. So there's something to do with jewels that could hold significant amounts of information, because some of those legends talk about holding everything that was ever known. Right? So it takes capacity to hold infinite knowledge.
Man, you just got me really excited because that reminds me of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, and a topic that we were discussing last week was the Shamir. Can you tell us anything about the Shamir? It's such an interesting curiosity.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I've heard the term. I'm just not. It's not clicking as to
It's the worm they use to carve the stones.
Oh, really?
Apparently King Solomon's temple was made with the Shamir.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with worms that would carve the stone, but that would suggest more of a technology and
Exactly.
something
Right.
that could be able to communicate to do what they wanted it to do, as opposed just to making holes all over the place.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of interesting for sure.
Pale Rider says, how do you spell that, Shamir? We talked about it last Friday, kind of in depth, Pale Rider. So if you're willing to go back to last Friday too, we did pull up a lot of information on that.
Well, the story goes that Solomon, as he was doing his inquisition of the demons, Asmodeus offered up some knowledge about where to find this worm, and it was guarded by a bird that, well, it says a woodcock, but you know, in the Anunnaki tales, you hear about Zu and all these others. So I think maybe it was a Zu. But anyway, he sends one of his emissaries to go find this Shamir, but all he finds is the empty nest. So he waits for the bird to return, and when the bird arrives, he shatters glass so that I guess the bird will drop the Shamir. I don't know, but I just found that very fascinating, and because the temple couldn't be built with any implements that were of war, which is in contrast to Azazel, right? So you couldn't use iron, or you couldn't shape any of the stones with iron. So he had to seek out. So Solomon had to seek out the Shamir. So I just thought that was really fascinating. Because if they're going to rebuild the third temple, as it were, they can't use metal to do it, right? It has to be done a certain way to be kosher. That's just fascinating. The Shamir.
Yeah, a lot of people, ask me at times, they're like, well, if they're gods, why would they need technology? And I'm going, well, they're not like the God of heaven, where he just says and something happens.
That's right.
And they're spirit beings that are having to take physical bodies to interact with the physical world. So to do things, they're going to need to create technology in this world to do those things for them. So that's why I don't underestimate the understanding of technology in the ancient world and what a lot of the things that the gods were actually doing.
Exactly. That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
They were taken away from the tree of life then themselves for, pursuing the tree of knowledge, as it were.
Well,
pretty fascinating.
I mean, they would have been created immortal, but in the physical world, that's a physical body. It's subject to physical laws and things, right? So things that they would, if they want to be in the physical world longer, with a spirit in a dwelling place, which is the body and the soul of a physical being, then they would have to do things to sustain it, right? Which is why you would have probably these drinks that they would drink, and why you would also probably have something like a counterfeit tree of life to try and sustain that physical body. I mean, it's not that spirit's going to die, but I mean, I don't think they're generally allowed into heaven either. So, I mean, where are they going to be, right? So they could be in another dimension, though.
There was one more question I had. You mentioned the destroyer, as it were, and so I was curious if you knew how that might relate to Orion, because I've seen how the Shiva statue that she's dancing the Najarata is compared to the same constellation as Orion. I'm just curious. Do you know about the parallels?
Well, in occult history, they actually believe Azazel is hung in Orion with rocks and chains, as opposed to the abyss.
Okay. Well, could the abyss be like space? I know that's a touchy subject with the flat Earth community, but that would kind of make sense, right? The abyss being like the waters above, maybe.
Yeah, I don't sort of fall into that line of thought, and it's only in a few areas in the occult. But typically, gods are, the important gods of ancient history are part of the Orion belt for the most part.
Oh.
Right? So let's say Osiris and Isis, as an example, they went there. And in other cultures, that's also quite common. Orion is also associated as the hunter with Nephilim. And so there's another, lanes with that. But no matter what, I mean, Orion is certainly very, very important to polytheism.
Could this be where the 7 and then the 8th kings come from? Because the pharaohs did incarnate from that belt, right? That's why they had the shafts in the pyramid, was to get the starlight from that area.
Well, that might be the story that they'll give, but they would be probably released from the abyss.
Okay. And so then Hashem would allow these characters to rise, and then they lead into captivity those that aren't saved, essentially, right? So that would follow the pattern of the Exodus out of Egypt, then, right? In a sense, is that kind of how this Revelations is to play out?
Yeah, kind of like that, I think. Yep.
Because I was reading about Zebubad, and he was supposed to be the son of Beelzebub, and he was the one that says Yahweh put it in his heart and Pharaoh's hearts and the men in his army to pursue the Hebrews into the desert, and then they got trapped into the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea, rather, I think it was. So I just found that really fascinating, because it also says in Revelation 17 that the same thing will happen again, that the kings it'll be put in their hearts to destroy Babylon. And so just thought that was really interesting. It seems like it's going to be a repeat of the Exodus story in a sense.
Well, typically everything does repeat itself. The only difference with the end time is that it's going to be a finality of everything that repeats itself.
Yeah, cycles and cycles.
Nothing new
Was
under
an
the
odd
sun.
noise.
I know.
Yeah.
I thought it was a marble dropping to the floor.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that
Falling
was.
a marble. Speaking
Like
of
a
marble,
vibration.
it's funny you said that, because somebody just said Orion was the name of the in the Men in Black movie. Orion was the name of the galaxy was on Orion's belt.
And
That
the
was
cat
the big
that
thing. Yeah,
wore
it was
around
on the
his
cat's
neck.
collar.
Well, as the alien mythos sort of gets interjected, they have to have a logical place where all of these beings come from, as opposed to being fallen angels and offspring of fallen angels. So they're going to have to come from these exotic locations. So
Okay, so
Well,
we're
Hades would be another one.
I interrupted probably. I'm sorry. We're 8 minutes past the 2 hour mark, and so we all, I know Gary has his life to live, and so does NPC, and so do I. So I'm going to close it down for now. But Gary, I had a question for you, since we're doing kind of like not the more talked about holidays. Don't you ask, tell me if you think it might be kind of fun to do maybe a St. Patrick's Day special. Maybe you're available for that.
Yeah, we could do a St. Patrick's Day one. Yeah.
Oh, that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, it's not nearly as deep as St. Valentine's. So we could do it.
But we could talk about leprechauns.
But we could talk about other things that sort of link into it, right? So
it's all connected. And the great thing is we get into talking about so many things that it's okay that if it's not necessarily about the day, we can get into discussion of these topics that were really fun for us, and obviously very fun for myself and for NPC. And it's okay that it doesn't always relate to the exact day, because it is all connected. Just like in your book, it's all connected. And just like in the real world, it's connected now. And so it'd be fun just a date to set aside or somewhere around there. We usually like to do Fridays, so we'll look at our calendars and we'll get back together on that. But it'd be kind of fun just to get into the leprechaun discussion, because I'm sure there's stuff about that, and you look at some of the, maybe even some of the movies on leprechauns. But it's a thought that we can consider for the future. And if there's anything that you really didn't get to ask NPC that you're dying to ask now and not wait a month, go for it.
No, but if I'd had a few minutes to think about it, I might have sprung one on you guys. But no, I think I can wait.
All right. Well, if that's all right with you guys, then I will say a prayer and we'll close out for the evening. How's that sound?
Yes.
Terrific.
Okay. Abba Father, I am so, so grateful for people like Gary Wayne and NPC. These two men, they are astounding. They make my brain work, and I love it. And as one of our listeners said earlier, when we first listened to Gary Wayne, our minds were blown and we couldn't comprehend what we were hearing. But now things click and they make sense. And I think, Abba Father, that is because we come to you first and we ask for your truth, your wisdom, and your discernment. And when we ask for those things happen. What I pray for most of all is for all of us to understand your kingdom of heaven on earth, the peace and the joy that we can have now. And I pray that we'd show that, not speak it to other people. Like Gary said, we're not telling, maybe I did a little bit, but mostly we should not be telling people how to celebrate this holiday or any other holiday. What we should be doing is showing by example and being people who shine your light. I pray that we would be conduits for your truth, and that people would see you and not judgment or legalism or self-righteousness, but more who you are through us, Abba Father. And that is me especially. So I should not be warning people what a horrible holiday that it can be, and be more like Gary and explain to people that you celebrate, people can celebrate the holiday as they feel fit. But if we can be an example through you, Yeshua, that maybe they'll see it a different way and practice the holy days and not the holidays. And we love you. We love you first. And we pray in your holy mighty name, Yeshua HaMashiach of Nazareth. Amen.
Thank you, Aaron.
Amen.
Hey,
Well,
I was wanting to ask if I could read the Revelation 14, 6-7 real quick. It's just the everlasting gospel. It's like 2 sentences.
yes, of course.
Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Gary, thank you for
Amen.
being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It was enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll do a Leprechaun March 17th special-ish around that date. I haven't looked. Doesn't matter. And NPC, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. And Sabbat Shalom. It's the first of Adar. And Rosh
That's right.
Hakadesh. It's the first, the sickle of the moon. Fauci is another word for sickle.
That's right. We have
But I
talked about
digress.
that. All right. Well, I'll let you guys go for the night, and we'll see you maybe in a month or so, Gary. But otherwise, we'll be thinking of you and praying for you, and we appreciate you. Have a good night and be blessed.
You too.
All right. Good night, guys.
Meow.
Meow. All right, I'm going to finish up with a song, because you know me, I love these songs, and not all of you love these songs, but I love these songs. So one more song to finish the night, and if you want to stick around and listen to it and know that these are Christ-fearing men that write this music and write these beats, then you'll stick around and just enjoy it. Peace and love of the Lord, guys. Good night.
Lord, please forgive me for my sins. I know I've done things in my life that you disagree with. I have little faith. I have problems I need help with. Please give me the strength to overcome these issues. Please. Rather serve in heaven than the brain in hell. I got my destiny, not the bleed for the demons. Time for me to supersede to the real father who doesn't mind getting bothered. I discovered that my heart was turning black. I gotta get my life on the right track. Turn my back on the past. I don't think it matters. Life of mine was about to shatter. Trying to get my mind together. I committed more than one sin. Felt that God wouldn't listen. Like a collision. Don't have the vision. Still in a mental prison. I'm waiting for the proof that God's son has risen. Destiny led you. Tried to explain. The words came out. Sounded the same in my brain. They seem to be burned by flames. I guess I'm a little insane. I'm the one to blame. Not reading the Bible as a child. Yeah, I know it's a shame. My mind yells wrong from right. It says religion is a game. People in my life could care less. If I get blessed, wear a crucifix. If I die today, there'll be no bliss. Don't care if I exist. Ain't got my flames living in the abyss. I know I need help. New friends, new goals, new chance. I gotta get out of this trance. I cried for the first time in a long time. I see you coming slowly with the light. Feeling good for once, not feeling the fright. Do you understand my hate? Am I too late? Can I proceed through the gold gates? I know I made mistakes. I'm about to awake. Can you relate to my fate? I understand why you wouldn't go to church. I couldn't come in since I shouldn't. Now I messed up. Please help from now on. I got my chin up.
I can hear it in the sound of your voice and in your rhythm. Then now you know that you must be forgiven. Now you know that you need a new beginning. It ain't about religion, it's the fact we're all sinning. And God can take you and mold you and shape you and form you to the man that your friends will look up to. He'll throw away the pain in the past that controlled you and take you to the foot of the cross to forgive you. I hope someday that you will be a strong Christian man with a new life, living for the master's plan. Old mindsets trying just to understand, on your knees praying for the Savior's hand. And though it seems like you're alone in the struggle, one lone soldier like the boy in the bubble, pouring out your pain in the microphone of troubles, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. Keep your chin up even when you slip up, even when your past starts to creep up. Chin up, keep your back on the pain, cut the chains of the same old things that led you down the wrong lane. You're on the road to becoming a new creation, born again with a new destination. All the angels in heaven sing in celebration, and I'ma tell you right now, you got my admiration. I hear your story and you really inspire me. I give the glory to the King of Kings entirely. I try to see and explain the peace that God has given me, but fall short. How can I describe eternity? Faith for the faithless, father to the fatherless, hope for the hopeless, a home for the homeless. How can I approach this? Words can't describe this. It's all about finding true meaning and purpose. Father, I pray that you lead my new friend into a place of peace and happiness. Give him faith, God, and show him how much you love him and how important he is. Open the doors that you have prepared for his life and lead him into your will and salvation. Amen.